Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is Defining Ethics, Good and Evil. These books are available at thephilosophicalанgle.com. If you'd like to inquire and make comment about us, make suggestions, feel free to give us an email at contact@thephilosophicalанgle.com. Along with me is my colleague and co-host, Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale and has an MBA from Wharton and is an independent venture capitalist out on the West Coast. Rick, good to see you.
And you.
The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media, and secondarily, to use those definitions to understand the righteousness and ethical superiority of conservative positions. And this week we're going to stray a little bit from that purpose and go into the last view of the Russian collusion story, why it is that they dwell on this story. And as everybody knows, we have on the front page, we have in every discussion on every major channel on TV and radio, the Russian collusion story between the Trump campaign and Russia. It's never ending and it's amazing. The whole story has been fabricated, yet it is such a major story with the media, and it's ubiquitous. The story is that there's a collusion by President Trump's campaign with the Russians to steal the election from Hillary. With no evidence that a crime has been committed, do the newspapers and TV talk shows go incessantly about the Trump campaign collusion and Robert Mueller and his investigation, and yes, there's clearly no evidence. And all they say is, well, the investigation is not over yet. So, oh yes, Mueller has come up with some indictments, but they don't have anything to do directly with the Russian election. And they don't have anything to do with the Trump campaign collusion with the Russians. Yet, even though without any evidence of any crime, the daily practice of the democratically controlled broadcast media is to put out every day more stuff or talk about the Russian collusion and Russians stealing the presidential election. It's amazing that the investigation of this whole story is now in its 2nd year, and yet they have yet to come up with any voter to say, oh yes, the Russians influenced me and I'm sure they influenced everybody else. They can't even come up with one person. So the upshot or the summary of all this is that this big investigation, ongoing for a lengthy period of time in spite of no evidence, and everybody talking, it continues. And it gets a little boring day after day, and I'm pretty much sick of it, as I'm sure everybody else is. So one day in the not too distant past, I'm speaking with a friend of mine who's a Democrat. And he's telling me that there's no doubt in his mind that Trump and his candidacy and his campaign, that there is collusion and it will be exposed. I was shocked. So there I was. I'm listening to him and noting his full conviction in the matter, and then I looked at myself and I noted my full conviction in the opposite direction. And my reaction was the following. He, being on the left, with his full conviction in mind, with absolutely no evidence put forth by the investigating authorities, pretty much Robert Mueller, my conclusion was, my friend is stark raving mad. It reminded me of Albert Einstein's famous saw that if you do something over and over, getting the same result, but you expect a different outcome, then you're demonstrating a mental illness. Well, I think we can apply this wisdom of Albert Einstein and his maxim here to this problem of the Democrats expecting a different result every day on the news. I think they've contracted schizophrenia, and I suppose there are several types of schizophrenia, but I'm well acquainted with one that is fully applicable to this disease that the Democrats have contracted. This type of schizophrenia is more specifically, I think it's called paranoia schizophrenia, and it occurs when the patient experiences a shock. That is, the patient in his life comes upon a serious problem that is too much for him to handle, and the trauma that the problem presents to the patient is so overwhelming. And it's so overwhelming to the extent that the patient cannot deal with the problem rationally, because the mind of the patient is not equipped to handle that trauma of the particular problem. It seeks to manufacture a smaller problem, which draws its attention away from the major problem. And typically, the minor problem will become is a form of paranoia. And an example of that is the progressive, utopian, socialist Democrats could not believe that Hillary lost. They had to manufacture a different problem to divert their attention away from their failure at the ballot box. So, for example, in paranoid schizophrenia, the patient thinks that other people are talking about him or her. And this is a small problem for the patient. And it results in the patients always trying to understand what it is that the other people are speaking about concerning the patient. Of course, they're not speaking about anything at all, but the patient is just imagining this. It's part of the disease that the patient has contracted. And this paranoia is just to allow the patient's mind to deal with the smaller problem so it doesn't have to deal with the larger problem, such as the Democrats speaking incessantly about Russian collusion. And so the patient doesn't veer away from that small, innocuous problem on which it focuses. The non-existent Russian collusion problem, they have to focus on that problem, so they don't have to deal with the larger problem, the one that's devastating to them, which is the American voting public doesn't agree with their policies. And this paranoid schizophrenia is exactly what happened to the left. So let's review the analogy. First, there is the devastating, overwhelming problem of the left, which is that Donald Trump won the election, and Hillary did not. And I'm sorry, but they could not take it. So what did they do? They made up a smaller problem on which to dwell. And this problem is that Trump colluded with the Russians to steal the election. And focusing on this problem relieves these progressive, utopian, socialist Democrats of facing the larger problem of having lost the election, of not being that popular. Well, maybe I shouldn't say not being that popular, because I believe in the popular vote they got 50% as did Donald Trump, and so or maybe they got just a little more than Trump did for president. But that's not how elections are won. Since the beginning of the Republic, an election for president can only be won by the Electoral College. And unfortunately for the Democrats, Hillary lost and Donald won. So now they must focus on the smaller problem in order to avoid having to focus on the larger, devastating problem of who won the election of the President of the United States. So all this daily media stories are nothing else but the patient suffering from schizophrenia. The Russians are they're out to subvert the U.S. election system. They're out to rob the American public of democratic justice. Those evil Russians. Oh, people, I think we should feel sorry for the patient. Well, Rick, what do you think of these problems of the Democrats? Of this whole investigation and.
Well, I would say, broadly speaking, Russia in one form or another has been committed to undermining the U.S. for a few generations, and that tendency has waxed and waned over time. Relative to what it was during the Cold War, it's perhaps still less. But should it come as any surprise that the Russians, or for that matter, the Cubans or the Chinese or any of the other, or Iran, any other problem countries out there for us, should it come as a surprise that they would try to undermine us in a variety of ways? I think not. Speaking from the point of view of a democratic strategist, what would I do? Well, I would try to delegitimize the Trump presidency as best I could. They seem to think that focusing as much attention as they do on this potential scandal is the best route forward to help the Democrats retake the House and reclaim the hundreds of lost seats in the legislatures across the various state houses that occurred under the Obama administration, which frankly was, from the point of view of Democratic presence at the state level, really a complete disaster, historic disaster. It doesn't surprise me that the media hounds, who are not a terribly high quality anyway, and obviously allied in many cases with the Democrats, would kind of follow along with all this. What's interesting from the perspective of a Trump doubter like myself, who did not originally support Trump, who supported Cruz and actively campaigned on behalf of Cruz, is that relative to where Trump has come from in terms of coalescing support at a minimum within the Republican Party and actually beyond, I would say, to include an increasing number of Democrats, particularly in the Midwest, the progress, and this you can read it daily in his approval ratings, has steadily increased. So what's interesting is that despite all this negative publicity, his actions and his policies, which on balance have been very solid, never mind the tweets and the polemics and the ad hominem attacks, leaving that aside, his actual policies, beginning with tax policy, but also including breaking the deal with Iran, his rapprochement with North Korea, his handling of Russia. There's a lot to praise there. There's a lot that's been very, very effective. and the American people notice, and that's why the ratings are going up. So, in a way, from a Republican strategist point of view, you kind of want to encourage the Democrats to keep doing what they're doing, because they're missing the point. And if they keep doing what they're doing, and rely, pretty much on Bernie Sanders to provide policy guidance, I see the likelihood of, this blue wave allowing them to retake Congress, for example. I think it's receding, actually. I think they had an opportunity. They may still have an opportunity. Trump could still make mistakes. Things could still blow up in many different parts of the world, the Middle East, North Korea. There's ample scope for error. We live in a volatile world. But if the Democrats in the fairly near future don't refocus their efforts on something more substantive, I think the likelihood of the Republicans retaining the House and increasing their lead in the Senate and holding on to their enormous gains at the state level across many legislatures will be the order of the day come November, and it'll turn out to be, at least as bad a nightmare for the Democrats as the Trump election was.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Hey, you said something about the media not being very competent.
They're not.
Why do you say that?
Well, the degree to which they've fallen away from reporting the facts. I mean, how many Walter Cronkites are there out there today? Any? It's become one side versus the other. It's Fox versus the others, essentially. I mean, at this point, the Wall Street Journal is, kind of the most balanced source of news.
And their readership is growing tremendously.
Yeah. And traditionally, they've been thought of as obviously conservative, but compared to a Fox News or compared to some of the Breitbart or some of these other media outlets, the Wall Street Journal, on balance, appears, kind of center right. There's no kind of center left publication left. They're gone of any major stature. The Christian Science Monitor, I don't know, so it's obvious that part of the problem, I think, with media generally, is the outlets that aren't making a lot of money, that are losing advertising, have had to fire a lot of reporters. Actually, that's happened in the New York Times. That's happened at a lot of the other national newspapers and regional newspapers, and so they're not able to attract and retain the quality of staff that they used to be able to attract and retain.
Right.
And that there's an issue there too. It's not simply that the editorial boards have gone off the deep end. It's actually retaining good staff and attracting good staff that's become a problem. So there's a structural issue there too.
Okay. Rick, thanks for your comments, and everybody, we're going to see you next week on The Philosophical Angle. Thanks for joining us. Rick, thanks.
Thank you.